So we're going to have first Piaras by video, by recorded video transmission, and after that we'll go to a presentation from Declan Smith of the CSO. Piaras.
Hello everybody, my name is Piaras Einri and I'm a lecturer in geography in University College Cork. And in fact my special subject is migration, and I've worked on this now since the 1980s, and indeed we've just launched a major report on Irish emigrants today in which we asked them certain questions about voting rights. So I have a direct personal interest in this, and indeed we've been all around the country to gather people's views, and we've also talked to immigrants online. My first experience of this in fact is a personal one. I did serve in the earlier part of my life in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Brussels and in Beirut and in Paris, and it came something of a surprise to me to find that as a member of the department, although I was a serving Irish taxpayer abroad in the duty of the country, that neither I nor any of my colleagues had the right to vote in Irish elections. And it became even more surprising when I noticed that we were actually the channel through which the voting papers for guards and army personnel serving abroad were passed. So here we were vindicating, so to speak, the rights of other Irish citizens working in the service of the state to vote, while we ourselves had no such right. And I suppose it hadn't really occurred to me until then that it was something that was rather unusual, that while you were abroad working for your country, you didn't actually have the right to vote in your country. And that became the subject of something of a controversy in the mid-1980s in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and eventually led to a change of regulations, and we did then acquire the right to vote. Now I say this as background because it's around the end of the 80s. That's the time of the last major wave of Irish emigration that public campaigns began about this, and I would pay tribute to Liam O'Cunningham and others in Glór and Geordie who set themselves up as far back as 1988 in London. And over the course of the 1990s there were a whole series of campaigns spearheaded by Irish emigrants in places like New York and London and further afield, including Australia. And ultimately none of them actually came to fruition. And we still have a situation today where Irish emigrants are denied the right to vote. Now, I'd like to make a few very basic points, and I suppose the first one is that this, in fact, means that we are the exception rather than the rule. In Europe, for instance, something like 36 countries give the right to vote on various terms and conditions to their own citizens. In the United States and in Canada and other parts of North and South America, it's also the norm. So, in fact, we are now the people out of step. If we look at Irish emigrants today, they're not like the immigrants of the past. It used to be argued, for instance, that you were out of touch as soon as you were out of the country. That's no longer the case. The emigrants that we interviewed all around the world show themselves to be intensely and passionately interested in Irish affairs. The first thing they did when they got a chance was to log on to Irish newspapers, watch Irish media, get the news from home via Skype. So these are a connected generation. They are people who are extremely concerned on a personal level with the ongoing connection which they have with the homeland. And the other point I would make, going back to the 1980s again, is that of the nearly 500,000 people who left in that period, something like half came back. And they came back as people who were re-engaging with the Irish political process, who indeed had stayed in touch with it while abroad, and who could fit back in and become political participating citizens once again. So I would see the same thing as being very much the case now. Today's Irish migrants do have a very strong connection with the country. In many cases they're likely to return. They're well informed about what's going on. And I would add a further point, which is that in very many cases, people feel that they had to leave, perhaps in circumstances which they wouldn't necessarily have chosen. And they do want to have a say in the politics of a country, which they have left perhaps unwillingly and to which they aspire to return. So in that sense, they regard it as a matter of simple and plain democracy that they be given some voice in the affairs of their own country. Now, we did complete a national survey in the last several months at this stage. We called to something like 2,400 households around the country, and we've spoken to a large number of immigrants online, and indeed we also conducted a major survey of immigrants online. We had about 1,500 responses, and among the questions which we asked were two key ones about voting intentions. We asked people, did they think that immigrants should have the right to vote in presidential elections, and if so, whether that right should be for a certain period of time, or whether it should be for an unlimited period, in other words, the rest of their lives. And we also asked people, both in Ireland and abroad, whether in the case of national elections, or general elections that is, the same rights should accord to immigrants, and again, whether they should be limited in time, or whether they should be for life. And the data we got was actually very interesting. In the case of the household views, that is, the representative views of householders that we interviewed all across Ireland, we found a very strong majority in favour of the idea that the right to vote, both in presidential and in general elections, should be extended to all immigrants. They were split about half-half on the question of whether that should be for life or for more limited time. But less than 20% of people were opposed to that idea, and the don't knows were very small, only 4 or 5%. In the case of immigrants themselves, as you might expect, there was an even larger majority, well over 80%, in the case of both presidential and general elections, argued strongly that they should have the right to vote, and a greater majority in both of those cases argued that it should be for life. So in both cases, householders here in Ireland and immigrants themselves, there's an ongoing strong interest in Irish affairs. There is a feeling that they want to continue to be involved in Irish affairs and that they want to be able to express that involvement in the most meaningful matter in the political arena, that is, by being given the right to vote. One further point I'd like to make, and which has been taken up on several occasions, is the question of whether it would be sufficient to extend the right to vote to citizens abroad, where that right would only be for seats in the Seanad. Now, the position that we took is twofold, and the first one reflects the position put forward by various lobbying organisations in the diaspora themselves, and perhaps I can best express it by saying what Glór and Jory said about it back in the 90s. The group does not consider Seanad Éireann to be an appropriate forum for giving the Irish abroad a voice in the Government of Ireland. In other words, giving them a voice in the Seanad would become a way of preventing them having a real voice in Irish political affairs, and that is true, some say, in elections for the Dáil. So that's the position that we took when we constructed our survey. We discounted the question of voting in the Seanad. And of course, the second obvious reason why that was taken was because it appears likely that there may not be a Seanad for very much longer, and in that sense, the question may well be moot. So we would essentially say that our survey results strongly support what the Votes for Irish Citizens Abroad campaign has been saying. I think it's interesting as well that they distinguish between two kinds of rights, where they say that for those Irish citizens who have lived in Ireland and have emigrated, that they should have an unqualified right to vote in the Dáil. Whereas in the case of voting rights in the presidential elections, they propose that should be extended to all citizens of Ireland, including those not born in Ireland itself. And I think that's a very interesting proposal because it represents a very concrete way of expressing the relationship between the Irish diaspora and the Irish homeland, even though, while the post is largely honorific, it would not in fact give people some major degree of political control in the sort of more direct sense that would be implied by votes for the Dáil itself. Okay,
so that's Piaras's comment. He can't be with us for the reasons I've stated, but there is more detail than he was able to give there in that presentation in the written presentation that you have received. Now, in addition to that, we're going to have a presentation from Declan Smith of the CSO, and we're very glad Declan is able to do this. I should say at the outset that it's almost impossible to establish the size of our emigrant population, but given the limitations on statistics. But Declan certainly will help us understand some of the more recent trends.